What is up, guys? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Devante Parker, wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins, and breaking down what we think his potential fantasy outlook is. Before we get started, hit that subscribe button for me. Helps the channel out a lot. And also check out our website, fantasyaddictionnetwork.com, for a full list of rankings updated until the season starts. Now, Devante Parker had a massive breakout year last year, and those of you that owned him probably helped you win some championships. The way that he finished the season last year was on an absolute tear, and we kind of have to break down his season as a multifaceted look at what happens. And some of you may already know this, but basically, with the entire season for the Dolphins, started out absolutely atrocious, couldn't compete at all. They start shipping off all of their assets, acquiring tons of draft picks as they go. They switched from Ryan Fitzpatrick over to Josh Rosen. That was a complete disaster. Josh Rosen was a complete zero in the passing game and depressed any value from this team. They switched back to Ryan Fitzpatrick because Brian Flores didn't like the attitude of just tanking, even though they got lucky, in my opinion, because if Tua Tagovailoa hadn't gotten hurt in college, in his junior year, there's no way the Dolphins would have been able to get him at pick number 5. So they lucked out in that regard, and were still able to get a potentially generational, game-changing quarterback at pick number 5. So good on them for that. So there's massive changes to this team. Ryan Fitzpatrick most likely going to start the season, and they face basically a gauntlet to start the season against some of the top pass defenses, at least from last year. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Ryan Fitzpatrick is benched some point in the earlier part during the season and switch over to Tua and see what they have in him. I would prefer if Ryan Fitzpatrick played the whole year. They just make sure that Tua is able to, one, acclimate to this offense and to the NFL, but two, make complete sure that his hip is fully healed. But that's probably not what's going to happen. So we'll have to kind of project and see. If I had to put money on it, I would say that we'd probably see about half of the year from Ryan Fitzpatrick and half of the year from Tua. So that's kind of being baked into what we're expecting from Devante Parker. All right. That all being said, I've already mentioned to you that the Dolphins have one of the hardest, if not the hardest, strength of schedules projected against the pass. Strength of schedule can be murky when you're trying to work that into preseason analysis. It doesn't necessarily mean all that much because defenses can change drastically, injuries can happen, so what we expect to be a tough defense could end up being a really soft defense as the season goes on. So we're not going to put too much weight into that. It's just something we want to throw in the bucket. Now, last year, Devante Parker had 72 receptions and 1,200 receiving yards and 9 total touchdowns. That touchdown count definitely helped add to his fantasy production. He finished with the 11th most fantasy points with 246, ending up as a wide receiver 1 and averaging 15.4 fantasy points per game, which was 15th best in the NFL. But that's not really telling the whole story. So obviously we'd already laid out kind of how the season went, and starts the season out just completely terrible. Doesn't even really do that much through the first 10 weeks. Obviously they had multiple quarterback changes in that time, and that was at the point where Preston Williams was pretty heavily involved. Preston Williams actually out-targeted Devante Parker while he was there. Then week 11 happens. Preston Williams is out for the season. Devante Parker takes over as the sole recipient of the vast majority of Ryan Fitzpatrick's targets. Game script is there. There's no run game. Their defense is terrible. They're constantly having to throw the ball. And as you can see, with the exception of that game against New York Jets, averaging about 10 plus targets every single week. Devante Parker finishes the season as one of the best wide receivers in the NFL for fantasy. You see, he has a week against Philadelphia where he has a top 6 performance, and then he also has 4 weeks in that span where he finishes as a wide receiver 1, averaging over 20 points. Only has one down week against New York, and overall really did a number for your fantasy teams because he was basically free. Most people acquired him into free agency, so definitely one of the more undersung fantasy winners from last year. So when we look at, again, as we kind of talked about, before and after Preston Williams got hurt. So leading up to that Preston Williams injury, Devante Parker only had 92 fantasy points through those first 10 weeks and averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game. Both of those were barely the points per game wasn't even a wide receiver 3. But once Preston Williams went down, he skyrocketed to 154.2 fantasy points, which was number 2 in the NFL, averaging the third most fantasy points per game at 19.3. So that is a massive swing. It's not 100% fair to just attribute that jump to the Preston Williams injury, because a lot of other things was happening to this team. They were getting in rhythm. Ryan Fitzpatrick was basically getting more involved in the game. Brian Flores had kind of started to develop a winning attitude in Miami. Even though they finished the season as 5-11, they started the season out looking like they were going to be the worst team in the NFL. So, and obviously during that first run, as we said, Josh Rosen was completely terrible. So you had multiple games in that first 10 weeks where Josh Rosen was involved. But there is still definitely something we have to consider with Devante Parker really not being able to stand out until he was the only guy there. Now, last year he finished with some of the most deep targets in the NFL at 28. If that has to come down, like if the defense is playing any better or Tua doesn't force the ball deep down the field as much as Ryan Fitzpatrick was, that could hurt his upside. He was averaging 16.7 yards per catch and 9.4 yards per target, which were both relatively high, both in the top 20 among wide receivers. His catchable target rate was 72.7%, which was 82nd, and his true catch rate was 83rd. So although Ryan Fitzpatrick wasn't doing him any favors, he also wasn't converting on a lot of the passes that he had the ability to catch. So that's definitely a little bit concerning in the efficiency department, but I believe that Tua is a much more accurate passer than Ryan Fitzpatrick, so even if the volume goes down slightly with Tua, the efficiency should go up, so it kind of negates itself a little bit. So I really think the biggest concern for Devante Parker right now is how healthy will Preston Williams be? How much better will the run game in Miami be? And will their defense end up being any better? Because if they don't get the same game script that they were getting, Devante Parker's volume is going to go through. It's gonna plummet quite a bit. So all that being said, we have him projected at 70 receptions, 1,034 receiving yards, and 7 total touchdowns. That still puts him well in the range of being able to finish as a wide receiver too. And fortunately, his ADP has not risen as massively as some people were expecting. You can still get him around the 5th, 6th round. I would definitely consider taking him in the 6th round. There's still a lot of guys in the 5th round that I typically take over Devante Parker. In any draft that I've done thus far, I haven't been able to acquire him. He carries obviously pretty massive upside, showing you what he could do last year, but definitely have to question whether it was a one-hit wonder. There were a lot of things that went right last year that helped Devante Parker's massive season, and overall, I'm not banking on all of those factors coming into play again. I think he was more a product of what was happening around him rather than a true massive emergence. And that's not to say that Devante Parker is not a good player, but if he's not getting the same volume that he was last year, you can't expect him to get the same fantasy production. So that's my take on Devante Parker. Let me know what you guys think, and hit that like and subscribe button for more videos like this one. We'll see you guys in the next video.